Hey everybody, Henry here, actually with Facecam this time, and I'm joined by the one and only Jason2890. Now, you've hit #1 in the world how many times at this point now?
It's been in like 5 or 6 different seasons, and then
Wow.
some of the seasons it's been a couple times within that season.
That's unbelievable. Well, that is 5 to 6 more than I have ever hit it. So clearly a man who knows what he's talking about when it comes to PvP. But today specifically, we're going to be talking about different kinds of team construction. A lot of the time, I feel like a lot of people start with more of an ABC, like a balanced style team, or an ABB, which I know like back in the day someone like Wallower was very good at recommending. So when it comes to building teams where you have your lead and a closer Pokemon that share a similar weakness, what do you like about running specific teams like that?
Well, there's kind of some advantages and disadvantages to doing things like that. The way I see it, you know how you have like meta Pokemon that people use every season, then you have people that run anti-meta. They're like, okay, I'm going to beat those people that are running the meta Pokemon. So ABA to me feels like it's kind of like an anti-meta style of team building.
Okay.
And the way I see it, there's a lot more nuance in how you play, but they tend, in the current team building meta, I guess you could say, they tend to have more play into different teams than standard ABB teams. Because like the way that the GBL, you know, the blind 3 format meta has kind of evolved over time is at first, like the very first GBL season, everyone was just kind of slapping 3 Pokemon together, you know? People didn't really have a good sense of team synergy or how, you know, having plans for what are you going to do versus this Pokemon. So people were kind of just doing whatever. And then some people came along with a little more strategy in the team building. Like Caleb, I know, had his original Skarmory double grass line that was kind of going wild in season 1. And then people kind of piggybacked off of that idea and were like, oh, this is like a really good idea. ABB teams, you know, you have a B Pokemon that you safe swap, and then it lures out their best counter to your closer Pokemon, so you presumably lose switch, but then finish it off with your A Pokemon, and then your second B Pokemon switches. And it's a great strategy. And people have kind of run with it where that is sort of the prevailing meta that's kind of stayed over the years, where people have, it doesn't necessarily have to be strict ABB where the last 2 Pokemon are same typing, but generally people try to safe swap a Pokemon that's going to lure out a Pokemon that the third would be vulnerable to. And so what I've done with ABA teams is kind of thrown a wrench in that sort of plan, where people think, okay, you're ABA weak to something, so what do you do whenever you encounter that thing that you're weak against? And that's one way of looking at it. You're obviously not going to win all of them, but the other way to look at it is how people tend to build teams is if they have a lead Pokemon that beats your lead Pokemon, once that Pokemon's out of the way, usually your second Pokemon in the back that shares the typing with your lead Pokemon has a lot of play. And the way I try to construct my ABA teams is that I try to have my lead A be somewhat flexible against its counters, where even if it doesn't win, it'll be able to put a dent in them, do a decent chunk of damage, maybe grab a shield, and then that way, even if they decide to preserve that Pokemon for later, my second A should be able to overcome the lead Pokemon with an energy lead or with all the damage I've done to it from my lead A. So the last Pokemon still has a chance. So like I wanted to give a couple examples of teams I've used, like ABA Steel. I had a Registeel Medicham Bastiodon team like maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago.
And I can say I lost to you when playing that game. And I'm pretty sure that I had a very good lead into your team, and I lost because you just outplayed me. A lot of the times when people construct an ABB style team, we've seen some teams like Bastiodon Double Razor Leaf, where the save switch mon has no flexibility. It's purely just baited out, hard lose, and then try and sweep. But most of them are, like if we think back to like the classic Tho of Azu, Sableye, and then Alolan Marowak, where the Sableye was more flexible. And it seems like you've kind of taken that archetype but flipped it to have that flexible safe switch mon just as a lead.
Like that's the thing, to use an ABA team effectively, you really need to have a good sense of team building and know how, like, which Pokemon are going to be valuable in the back, when you'll have to like pivot into something, then pivot back out of it. There's just a lot more nuance than an ABB team, where ABB teams are typically pretty straightforward to play. If you don't win lead hard, you safe swap something, then it, you know, possibly soft lose and then come in, farm down with your lead, and then try to make some plays with your second B Pokemon on the back. But what I've found, in some ways, ABB teams have kind of evolved to where they kind of RPS each other, because people will run an ABB team, and then someone will build an ABB team specifically to counter that. So you'll have like someone running fighter double steals, like you know, the classic Annihilate Dugong Bastiodon line, and then you'll have someone else that decides to run Fairy Double Grounds, and then those Pokemon, if those two teams collide against each other, the Fairy Double Grounds is going to go keep alignment the entire way because you'll lure out one of their ground types, but they have a second one in the back.
Yeah.
So in a way, ABB teams to me feel a little bit more RPS in later metas compared to earlier. They used to be the go-to option for flexibility, but people have decided to take it a step further and then build ABB teams specifically to counter other ABB teams, and it ends up causing a sort of unwinnable games where you can't really play out of it because they have an answer for you the entire way. Whereas ABA teams, people don't really tend to account for when team building because they're so rare.
Okay.
That you end up having a lot more play than ABB teams some of the time.
I think that's a very interesting point. Something that you had mentioned was with ABA, there's more nuance required in terms of knowing which of your mons have value and which do not. And it sounds like a lot of that can come down to like team reading and situational understanding of like based on their lead. If they're running a more traditional team, which most are, as you mentioned, since ABA is rare, you can kind of guess that if they have something like an Azumarill lead, they're probably going to have something in the back that can beat Toxapex. Do you think that less readable line yourself can help give an advantage as well, just in terms of opponents not necessarily knowing what you have behind your lead?
Yeah, sure, because you kind of subvert team building expectations when you run an ABA line. So a lot of times, like when I first started running that ABA team I mentioned earlier with like a Registeel lead with Medicham Bastiodon in the back, I would that was back when Registeel was the king of the Zero Shield. Like with Zap Cannon at its full power, you basically like are guaranteeing, even in a bad matchup, to at least get a shield off your opponent or do massive damage to them by landing like a Zap Cannon or a Focus Blast. And then you kind of lull your opponent to a false sense of security when they finally take out your Registeel. So I'd be in situations where I lose the lead and they take out their Registeel and I bring in Medicham, start punching them down, and they say, you know what, the Registeel's gone, let me go save swap my Skarmory now, because they're not going to have an answer to that. And then that's the worst thing you can do against a team like me. That's the kind of teams I run, because then I stay in with Medicham for a while, build up a bunch of energies, it's so dangerous with energy, and then you bring in Bastiodon, just completely farm them down, and then they're just stuck in a situation where they're against like two Pokemon with close to 100 energy that are, very healthy still. That's why I think the ABA teams, if you don't know about them now, unfortunately, I'm in a situation where I start using a team and then people catch on to it. They know what I'm running, so I don't really always have that sort of element of surprise unless I'm coming up with a new team. But it still works more often than you'd think, where people think, oh, okay, I took out the lead Pokemon, which is really good against my back Pokemon, so this back Pokemon has a lot of play now, and then I have a second counter.
What I enjoy periodically is how I know you found a strong team, because you'll periodically post on Twitter being like, thank you, Annihilape, and it'll be 3-5-0 screenshots, and I'm like, oh, Jason's up to his nonsense again. So you had mentioned that that a little bit of the element of surprise for you particularly is gone just because of the levels of success that you've reached and the fact that you often stream your Legend Push, people are aware of what you're running and they emulate it. How does that feel to have so many people try lines that are something that you created and find similar success with? Because that's got to be a pretty cool feeling.
It is really cool. Like I'm in a few Discords where people ask me for team advice and people will post battles and stuff like that. And then I just get tags every now and then saying like, oh, Jason, I ran into your line like 5 times today. I'm like, ooh. Like that's cool. It's cool just to have something that's known as your line, but then also to have it be popular enough where people are seeing it several times a day. It's just exciting. Because I think like, unlike a lot of other content creators, like people like you, there's no like home slice Henry line because you put out so many videos of different lines, so it's like you're constantly switching teams. But for me, like I tend to pick maybe 1 or 2 strong cores and then build teams around them for each season. So they tend to get the reputation of like the Jason line, because it's like, okay, this is the team that I use for like more than half of the season. I tend not to really keep my teams hidden because for one thing, people battle me, they see me stream, and then for another thing, like people are always asking me anyway for lines. So I just like, I'll post my teams on Twitter, which I think is also something that people pick up on and then start trying to copy it as well. Even
with you being pretty open about what you're running, you are still able to have that level of success. And I do think one of the things that, at least from playing you and losing to you, in my opinion, too many times, is with these ABA lines specifically, as you mentioned, you aren't switching these lines every 2 seconds. This is something that you'll come up with a line and learn the ins and outs of it very particularly to understand what can I survive, what can't I survive, and what to do in these situations. So
I feel like when I first started, I didn't really have a good semblance of team building, but just over the years, I would see other team builders, watch other YouTube videos, and then kind of get a sense of the types of teams that people construct. And then I said, you know, what if I come up with a team of my own and then find out a way to play it where I have play into all these teams? And that's what a lot of it comes down to. Like on a season, I'll track a lot of teams that I've seen people using just to get an idea for the meta, because this season in particular, obviously there's a huge meta shift with the counter nerf and all these other Pokemon getting rollout and everything. And so I wanted to get an idea of what sort of teams people are running, and then pick some Pokemon that I think are going to have a huge impact. And at the very beginning of the season, I was really high on Araquanid. I thought for sure Araquanid was going to be like a major player near the end of the season, but I kind of had to bench Araquanid because it didn't end up having quite as much play. It was still decent, but not as much play as I'd hoped. But Ariados was one. Like I had an ABA poison line that I had a lot of success with earlier this season with Ariados lead with Drifblim Toxapex in the back, and that ended up being like way more successful than I expected it to be, because Ariados just ended up being like way more flexible than I expected, and the pacing's so good, and then Lunge has like really good coverage moves like Trailblaze as well. You can fight back against the grounds. It's just very, very powerful and very quick.
Yeah. And I believe that's a line that you were able to hit rank 1 in the world with, and that's a line that technically triple loses to Pokemon like Alolan Sandslash, but I imagine along the way some of those Sandslash did not emerge victorious. So
right, because that's the thing. Alolan Sandslash would be tricky, but then in the lead, if you see him in the lead, you pace to Lunge at the same rate as they pace to Ice Punch, and then I think in the one shield, like if they go for straight Ice Punch, you could like lunge them twice. Like if you shield the first one, lunge them twice, then you survive the next one, get to a third lunge, you end up winning like the 1-0 versus them. And then if they decide to commit a shield, if they don't want to lose the lead, then you end up debuffing them 3 times and getting them so low that Drifblim can farm them down, doesn't even have to worry about the Ice Punches.
Basically, and you basically just make their energy so inefficient that they either have to give up switch or throw extremely inefficient energy.
Yeah, so I have some examples of ABA teams. I think this is some footage from last season, and it was when I was running Dugong and Annihilape Bastiodon. We had me leading Dugong into a Vigoroth. People ask me, what do you do? Keep in mind, this is last season. Vigoroth was still good back then. But people ask you, like, oh, what do you do when you go against, like, a fighter, which Vigoroth is pseudo-fighter here. And with a team like this, you obviously want to keep away from Bastiodon. Even though Vigoroth doesn't really threaten Bastiodon with its charge moves, you don't want to take that double super effective counter damage. So I tend to just play out the Zero Shield. And if I remember this battle correctly, I actually don't play the lead very well. I try to minimize their farm, but I ended up not even getting my Icy Wind off. Yeah. But you come in with Annihilape, and then they're forced to switch out. So even though they won lead, they give up switch advantage and bring in an Azu. And Azu's almost always run Ice Beam play rough. It's been a long time since I've seen a Hydro Pump. So I'm able to stay in for a bit with Annihilape, build up some energy, and then bring in Bastiodon here. And Shadow Bastion in particular. I really wanted to build a Shadow Bastion and make it work, and it seems like it's been good for the last 2 seasons, especially with the poison meta, because even though Bastiodon has less bulk, you're still just taking 1 damage from like every poison fast attack regardless.
That's awesome.
And the extra damage hurts a lot.
And one thing that I noticed is with the Annihilape is you farmed all the way up until right when they got that charge move on the Azumarill and then switched to really try and maximize the Annihilape farm. So even if Annihilape has to go against something that might be tough for it, matchups get a lot less tough when you have like 2 moves loaded and ready to go. So.
Right. And that's the thing too, because like with Bastiodon, you don't really need to fear Azu's charge moves unless, of course, they're running Hydro Pump. But like, so it doesn't really matter that they get to build up some energy on Annihilape. You're only taking that bubble fast move damage on Annihilape in exchange for getting a lot of energy, which could go a long way. So I'm able to farm down this Azu. They're going to bring in the Vigoroth, of course, to try to farm me down. But I have the Stone Edge ready. You know, you throw the Stone Edge here, you're either going to get a shield off of them or do massive damage. And I think they let this go right here. Yeah, they let this go, and then they're just within range for me to just snipe them with a 1 counter. And now I have Annihilape loaded with energy and a partially healthy Bastiodon, and they have a Tentacruel in the back. And at this point, like, this is a favorable matchup for Tentacruel on even energy, but at this point, whenever I am up, I have over 2 Night Slashes right now, you can just spam Night Slashes. And this is probably even, like, you don't see Tentacruel that much, obviously, but because Toxapex is more relevant, but like nowadays, this matchup, if you have Rage Fist instead, is even more favorable for Annihilape, even despite the counter nerf. You're still able to do so much damage with the guaranteed buff. We're able to just clean this up because we were able to get so much energy on Annihilape. So even though we lost the lead with Dugong, we ended up getting Bastiodon in a favorable matchup, and then having Annihilape be able to sweep in the end.
And that was a beginning of the match, as you mentioned, where it actually didn't work out the way that you were hoping, in that you were actually trying to click the move and then unfortunately did not get the damage off, but you're still able to get the win just by virtue of energy management there. And by your opponent thinking, well, there's probably not going to be a Bastiodon in the back, so they end up safe switching the Azumarill. You're able to get a bunch of energy. And that concept of just because your opponent switches doesn't mean you have to switch instantly ends up very much working in your favor, because you get all of that energy. And even though Tentacruel is technically an anti-fighter, down that much energy, not as much. So
this is running the same team, and this is into an Annihilape lead.
Okay.
Which looks a little scary, because Annihilape with energy beats this entire team. You know, obviously beats Dugong and Bastiodon, but then I don't want to switch in my Annihilape behind energy either.
Yeah.
So we stay in here, and we just intend on sacking Dugong. And the cool thing about this matchup, and even last season, obviously now it's even better for Dugong with the pacing that Annihilape has. By better, I mean less bad, I guess. It's still not good. But like at this, you get to the first Icy Wind before they get to a potential Shadow Ball, so you're always able to debuff them. And then this person decides to bait with Night Slash, which is even more favorable for me because I get all this extra Ice Shard damage. And then they throw here, and like, my Dugong, I have rank 1 IVs. I caught this like several years ago, and it's paid off so much because Dugong's bulk is just so handy. Where if they bait again here, which they do, another Night Slash, I survive. So they have to actually go for the nuke in the zero shields against my Dugong here, unless, you know, maybe it's breakpoint dependent. But I'm able to grab a shield and cripple the Annihilape here into the red before I bring my own Annihilape in, and then they bring in their Lantern. And this is not really that favorable for Bastiodon, so I'm going to have to go stay in here for a bit, but luckily their Annihilape is so low, and presumably their only Bastiodon counter if they're leading it, besides this, you know, hopefully Bastiodon will have play in the back, because that Annihilape that low health is not going to be able to take out Bastiodon, even though it's able to do so much fast move damage.
And this is where you have a bit of the surprise factor of the faster pacing on the close combat as well, because in this meta, a lot of people ran Shadow Ball, which was more expensive. And now you're doubled up, and your opponent may not know that. Close combat lands, they bring in the Annihilape.
Yeah, I lost track of their energy a little bit. I would have preferred to throw this move before they throw, but, you know, it happens. Yeah, one thing that's cool about close combat as opposed to Shadow Ball is they actually do the same amount of damage in neutral scenarios, and then close combat's 10 energy cheaper, because they both get stab from Annihilape's ghost fighting typing, and close combat just hits really hard. So they decide to shield here. And then
that's
we
probably
back
a good
to back.
sign, yeah.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, okay, Bastiodon on the back maybe. But then they actually have, Alolan Sandslash. Now, this is something that if I had reacted fast enough, if I were to play this battle over again, I could switch into Bastiodon, and then you can get to a Flamethrower before they get the 2 drill runs if you switch immediately. But because I didn't, I had to go stay in here to like at least get the Night Slash off so I can farm this down. This is the power of Shadow Bastiodon. Get these Shadow Smackdowns to end up taking out this Alolan Sandslash.
Yeah, because that's double super effective, but it's not going to...
Yeah, it does a lot, but that's the other... Like, the other pro, I think, to using Shadow Bastiodon is most things can't one-shot you anyway, so they still need to throw 2 moves.
Overall, like, I feel like this has been a very good demonstration and explanation of how these ABA-style teams work.
Yeah. I think part of, like... You know, you end up, like, with ABA lines, even if they know that it's an ABA line, you put opponents into difficult spots where they're not sure what to do. Like, they beat your lead, but they don't want to give up switch advantage and switch lock something that you can crush in the back. Like, if they have 2 Pokemon in the back that are, you know, if something's susceptible to Annihilape and something's susceptible to Bastiodon, you don't want to switch lock one of those things and just give me a free battery of energy. But you end up just getting in a situation where, like, do I want to just let my lead get farmed down? Because then, do I want to give Annihilape this energy and then going into my backline matchup in order, like, so you end up giving your opponent a lot of tough decisions where, like, they have to decide, like, do I want to, you know, give Jason a bunch of energy and maintain switch advantage, or do I want to swap out of this, even though I just, you know, worked hard to get switch advantage here, just so I could preserve my lead. Knowing so, you end up I feel like the more decisions you give your opponents, the more chances you have of them making a mistake. And I think that's a lot of what separates good battlers from great battlers, is just being able to capitalize on your opponent's mistakes and putting them in situations where they can make a mistake, if that makes sense.
Getting good players to make mistakes is something it's obviously the higher you go, it's the more difficult it is. And it's interesting to hear someone else who has a bit of a unique approach to it, because my way of kind of forcing people to make misplays is by running weird anti-meta picks, because people, like, if there's the Azumarill versus Shadow for Alligator matchup, people have that hyper optimized. But if I throw something weird at them, like a Fortress, they're like, oh man, what are those counts again? Like idiots.
Yeah, they don't remember the counts. They don't know
how
much damage they're going to do to it because they haven't run the sims with against Shadow Fortress.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a way to throw people off. So it's very interesting to hear that that's kind of your way of getting to throw people off.
Right.
When it comes to battlers who are looking to construct their own ABA lines. Because we've obviously gotten to hear about your success with it and the fact that you often build them quite a bit. So when building them, do you normally start with like a core you like to put in back, or are you normally looking for like more of a flexible lead pick?
It's really both. You kind of want you want to identify. Like I spend the season identifying common cores I've seen people use, and then trying to figure out which ones seem like they're the best in the current meta.
Okay.
And then I try to find like a versatile Pokemon that would be flexible enough to be a lead to a back to that core in the back line, if that makes sense. Like I think Ariados complements Toxapex pretty well, because even though they're both poison, they have very different strengths and weaknesses. Like Ariados does well against the Mud Boys because you have Trailblaze, and it doesn't really have to fear the Psychics too much. Like Malamar, you one shot with Lunge, so even in that matchup, like they're doing a lot of fast move pressure, but they have to fear all of your charge moves. So like either way, like they're the same type in that they're both poison, but they play very differently. And a lot of times people will be like, "Oh, Ariados, that must have been their Azu counter. I'm free to go safe swap Azu now that I took out their Ariados." And they safe swap Azu, and then bam, Toxapex, 100 energy, farm down.
Oh, brutal! Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So it's like a lot of it's just like kind of seeing how people play and how people have constructed teams for a given season, and then figuring out people's tendencies. Like, what are people safe swapping here? Someone's going to safe swap a Gastrodon because they think, "Oh, my Ariados is gone," and then I put Drifblim on it, and they're running Earth Power, Body Slam, like. Drifblim's just getting a huge farm too. It's tricky to kind of construct a team with that in mind. There's a lot of factors. You got to figure out how people are playing and what you've seen people be safe swapping, and like my style of team building is kind of like I kind of try to make the most out of my opponent's mistakes. So if they safe swap something that I can hard punish, I make sure that I'm able to farm up as much energy as possible coming out of that matchup, or have as much residual health coming out of that matchup as possible. So it ends up being where you have to really do a lot of research, and you really have to know how your matchups play out, and you really have to figure out something that will be able to subvert your opponent's expectations, but is still flexible enough to have play into some of its counters, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And it seems like a Pokemon that you've returned to quite a few times throughout has been that Dugong. It seems like, I mean, having, as you mentioned earlier, the rank 1 definitely doesn't hurt. But it seems like, Dugong's ability to constantly be a debuffer, it almost feels like Drifblim can do some very, very interesting things in matchups that it probably shouldn't be able to do, like just straight up beating for Alligator and stuff like that.
Yeah, as you could probably tell, I like debuff Pokemon, like Ariados with Lunge, and Drifblim with Icy Wind, and then Dugong with Icy Wind, because I think that's another part that plays into it too, is you debuff the opponent and you get them into a situation where it's a very safe farm down for one of your back Pokemon, and then you again put them in that position where they have to make a decision, like, do I just let my debuff Pokemon get farmed down here, or do I preserve this? Like, I like to think that my battles make my opponents very uncomfortable a lot of times, because I feel like I would be very uncomfortable playing against those types of teams as well, and that's kind of like what I strive for, because when people are uncomfortable, they're not sure what to do, they make mistakes, and then you capitalize on them. That's just kind of how team building works sometimes.
And again, I can confirm, having been the opponent on numerous occasions, very uncomfortable. Like, there's been a couple games where I've just genuinely like on paper I should hard counter you, and it ends up being a loss because you're able to so effectively leverage those pressures of debuff to either set up a big energy advantage for you, or to, even though you lost the lead, get switch advantage because your opponent ends up switching out. So it's still just making that, like trying to make them make that incorrect play and then being able to punish them for it. But yeah, like honestly, if you have any final thoughts here, you can go for it. But overall, I feel like this has been a terrific introduction to people to the wonderful and frustrating for opponents world of ABA teams.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for meeting with me and talking about this. Is fun, and I hope this video is helpful to a lot of people out there that are looking for team ideas or just looking for insight from the logic and about how specific team builds work. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Oh, thank you.